Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Alicia Tete. I am here to present to you all and talk about the impact of culture and stigma in the Black household. So here's where you all are able to hold me accountable. By the end of today, by the end of our hour together, you should have increased insight, increased knowledge around these four objectives. One, exploring the historical and current cultural trends. Two, being able to identify the impact of stigma. Three, assessing for the need for intervention. And then four, the application of Afrocentric social work. I'd like to start out with positionality. I like to speak a little bit to who I am so you can get an idea of the lens that I come from. You know, positionality speaks to the combination of our social identities. So I identify as an African American female, cisgender, heterosexual, American born, English speaking, able bodied. I have experienced discrimination in my life. I have been impacted by trauma, and those experiences contribute to how I view the world. It contributes to how I show up in the world as a professor, as a clinician, as a mother, as a friend. And then oftentimes, which I'll talk about in the presentation, um, our identities don't change, but how people view us does change. So I mentioned before, or if I didn't, I am a adjunct professor at Howard University, where I teach in the social work program, in the online program, and then I own a group practice in Charlotte, North Carolina, called Building Endurance. I define myself as a change agent. So I sit at the intersection of academic practice in the classroom and then clinical practice out in the real world. So I really like to bridge the connection between, you know, what's happening in school, what you're learning in the textbook, and then what does this look like in true application. Um, so let's. So we can't talk about stigma and what to do and what's going on without first looking at what does history tell us. Um, what does history tell us about mental health and where Black folks fall or fail, and how we got to be to where we are today? So there was a social scientist, his name was John Galt, and he believed that Black folks were immune to mental illness. So he suggested that, and this was during the times where we were enslaved. So he suggested that, you know, Black folks can't own anything, they can't participate in civil engagement, so there's no reason for them to be distressed. So that was his perspective. You can't have anything, so why would you be experiencing mental distress? There was also a physician by the name of Dr. Samuel Cartwright, who spoke to Black folks having this irrational desire to be white. So that was one thing that he suggested. He also suggested that we had mental illnesses because we did not want to be enslaved. And then lastly, he suggested that there was this sense of lethargy and dullness about us, which we would today identify as depression. And his answer to those experiences was to whip Black folks to engage in whipping and beating. So these were some earlier thoughts around mental health and African Americans. Around the time of the Civil War, there was an increase in identifying African Americans as insane. And it was proposed that this insanity took place because we had experienced too much freedom, which is wild, right? This idea that we were supposed to be belonging to someone, we should have kept, should have stayed enslaved, right? So there was this thought that with any sort of freedom, that would increase um, Black folks being or becoming insane. Um, Dr. Powell, a physician from back then, also felt like we didn't have any control over our appetite. We could not control our vices. And he felt that too contributed to a rise in insanity. So, again, at first we didn't have nothing, so we couldn't feel nothing, right? And then it was we can't free them because they don't know what to do with that freedom. So I just want you to keep these things in mind as we continue to lead up to where we are today, and the importance of language and the importance of how we're in relationship, with each other. The eugenics movement is also a huge piece of our history and a huge piece of the conversation around mental health in African Americans. There was this encouragement of births amongst people who were considered good genetic stock, right? So it was this idea that if you did not have good genes, you should not be reproducing. And this movement started, I believe, in the UK, and transferred here, started happening here, and there started to be this sterilization process for African Americans. And again, it was people who were identified as people who were poor, folks who were impacted by mental illness, um, folks who were accused of sexual promiscuity or sexual crime. They all fell in the category of individuals who needed to be sterilized and should not have been given the right to procreate. So during this time, about 18 states passed the law that allowed for this to take place. And again, this is just another layer to our history around us trying to get to the place of experiencing freedom and getting connected and knowing who we are. This is another layer in that story. Another crucial piece in this conversation around history is the victimization that happened. There was a point in time where lobotomies were taking place, and these were happening because they felt like there was a brain dysfunction that led to urban violence and inner city uprisings. And so, um, now let's mess with their brain to see if that can change things. Let's see if that will put a stop to what is happening in the US. And when you go and you read the literature and you hear the historians and the social scientists talking more currently, more presently, they're able to identify, like, hey, this violence is a reaction to systemic oppression. This is a reaction to poverty. This has to do with discrimination, as well as uh, violence that's brought on by the state, so at what we would consider today police brutality. But in the past, none of those things were taken into consideration. It's just like, let's try to get rid of the problem, the immediate problem, and let's not look at the different levels. Another crucial topic related to mental health and our history and Black folks. Last week, we just celebrated Black Maternal Health Week. And the whole reason why there is even a creation of Black Maternal Health Week is because, according to the most recent statistics from the CDC, which they were dated 2021, Black mortality, the maternal mortality for Black women, so Black women who are dying at childbirth, is 2 times higher than non-Black women, right? I will speak later in the presentation, and I have a colleague, Dr. Janice Thompson, who her capstone was around how resilience can harm us. And I think to this point, especially being a mother myself and having experienced some concerns with one of my hospital births, which is why I ended up having my second birth at home, I think one of the concerns that has come up with Black women and maternal mortality is this idea that we have a higher tolerance of pain. You know, we can tolerate it. We are more resilient. We're able to handle bad things because we've already had bad things happen to us, even though we didn't ask for those things. So I definitely wanted to include this. And in the past, it was viewed, and it still is, as a mental health concern, but it was called the baby blues, what we know of today as postpartum depression. And some of those signs include feelings of sadness, crying, hormonal mood swings. It can definitely result in anxiety, depression, psychosis. Postpartum affects 20% of all races, but over 40% of African American women are impacted. So we want to keep in mind that there is a connection to having that lower socioeconomic status, having the emotional and financial distress. Domestic violence is connected to it. Poor access to healthcare is connected to it. So again, we're looking at a layer of where there is a systemic issue, right? There's a systemic issue to what's going on. But again, we are disproportionately affected. So there is no conversation about mental health and about the stigma without exploring the history, without looking at the history and thinking about these systemic things that are really connected to our ability or inability to get treatment and to get services regularly. So we can't leave racism out of the conversation. We can't leave discrimination. We can't leave the violence or poverty out of the conversation. I identify as a clinician who practices from an anti-racist position. And we are challenged to call out when discrimination is happening, right? As a social worker, by the code of ethics, we should be operating from a place of social justice. So me speaking to my positionality statement at the start is connected to that. And for those that are watching that identify as social workers, as change agents, we are called to speak out. We are called to speak out when things are taking place that are not right, when folks are being marginalized. So again, we can't talk about how to intervene currently. How do we decrease the stigma currently if we don't have a little bit of history of how do we even get here? How do people even begin to have this natural mistrust, right? How did we begin to kind of turn inward towards ourselves, which I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides. So we've all heard about stigma. And I wanted to be able to really break it down for that micro, meso, and macro perspective. So there is public stigma. So public stigma involves the negative or discriminatory attitudes that others may have about mental illness. So this is how people generally feel, right? How the general public feels, and thinking about how when something is stigmatized, so when it is viewed that um, something is wrong with that person, right? Then the public may deem them as dangerous. A person may be deemed as incompetent. They may be deemed as unpredictable. They may be blamed for their disorder when we think about public stigma. Then there's self stigma. So this refers to the negative attitudes, to include internalized shame that folks impacted by mental illness may have about their own condition. And so now they may have taken what other people have said, and then internalize that information, and that then dictates how they move, how they maneuver, even how they feel about themselves. Um, as a psychodynamic clinician, I feel like everything in who we are has to do with what did or did not happen in childhood. And so this particular piece, this self stigma, has to do with what were the messages that we received as a kid, right? What were some of the messages? What were the messages that we received either at home or at school? And then how do we begin to internalize those messages? So that's definitely something to think about. And then lastly, structural stigma, which has to do with what we just took a look at. Structural stigma is more systemic. It involves policies. It involves how organizations are structured. And in structural stigma, there could be the intentional or unintentional limitation of opportunities. So folks who are impacted by mental illness, there may be lower funding for a specific clinic or a specific study or even research. Speaking of research, there's when we look at the literature and we look at, you want to pay attention to who is writing the literature and who is the literature about. And we know that due to, some mistrust, there's mistrust around even medical providers sometimes because of some of the past studies that were done, either without consent or not being honest about the study. So because of that, when you start to look at literature and you look at interventions, they were created for and by white folks. So I often talk to my students about the importance of, even if you don't like macro level social work, engaging in research, participating in research, doing your own research, so that our voices can be amongst the literature. Because otherwise we're reading about things that were not created for us, and so that's really something for us to think about. In order for us to be represented, we have to participate. So again, just kind of rethinking your own ideas and feelings around engaging in research, and how it can be helpful, how it can be helpful for us. So what are some of the harmful effects of stigma? A lot of these I'm sure we are familiar with. Once discrimination has happened, once stigma has happened, it becomes a barrier for folks to engage in treatment. They may have difficulty at school and work. They may start to have not feel as hopeful. They may have reduced or lower self-esteem. There may be an increase in psychiatric symptoms, difficulties in social relationships, and honestly, just a reduced likelihood to even stay in treatment. So thinking about what are some things that I can do to help reduce that stigma? Because we want folks to be able to engage in services and get the help that they need. We want folks to be able to um, be their best selves. I think that's really important, and that's really what this conversation is all about. So I want to speak to applying the African Center perspective to the treatment of mental health concerns. And this perspective is something that can be adopted, in your own home, in your own family, as well as for the clinicians that are watching. This is something that you can consider if you are working with clients who identify as African American. So one of the first things is the interconnectedness of human beings. It is proposed that we live best when we live in harmony. So really exploring what the current environment is like for the client. How can that environment be improved for them, especially if they are trying to navigate through difficult things, like what is the environment that they're going home to. And if you're watching and you're observing and you create your own home, right? You're not a clinician, but you have folks in your home that you're responsible for, really giving some thought to how is the environment here set up. Spiritual nature of human beings. This perspective encourages that spirituality connects us. And then there's also a connection to our creator. And how can we begin to view people just based on humanity and not based on all of these other things and all of these other titles? Collective identity asks the question, how are we similar? So what connects us? I think a huge piece of folks feeling like they don't want to engage in treatment is because they feel othered. And it's not a good feeling to feel like there's something going on with me. I'm different from you. And this principle really encourages us to think about how are we the same? And there is a phrase offered that I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. And so again, really thinking about when harm happens to one person, it happens to the collective. And how can we avoid that? How can we make sure that doesn't occur? Connection of mind, body, and spirit. Optimum health has everything to do with how we're taking care of ourselves in a very holistic way. And so it's not just that I am making sure that I have employment or housing. I'm also invested into my emotional self. I'm also invested to the part of me that's sexual. I'm also taking care of the financial piece. And so really thinking about how do we achieve balance when we're trying to take care of ourselves and making sure that we're not just focusing on that one area. And then interpersonal relationships, again, just like when we think of interconnectedness of human beings, a person is a person through other persons. So again, just this principle and this idea of us having harmony within the community. And what does that look like? And so instead of us, I hear a lot of rallies and, people are doing great work around violence, for example, gun violence, and really trying to figure out what can we build so that we are more in community with each other, as opposed to less. How can we begin to collaborate as organizations? That's something that I have really tried to move into in the past year and a half, like not feeling like I have to lead the charge on everything. Like, who are some folks that I can partner with that are already doing what I'm doing, right? So really exploring how can we have more harmony as the community? How can we come together? more as the community. So that is just an overview again of applying that African-centered perspective. I encourage you to look more into it if you're unfamiliar with it. It is definitely not something that was widely talked about in school, but I think it is a perspective for those of you that are watching that work with Black and Brown folks. It is a perspective that I think could be helpful if that's the population that you're working with, because it is a perspective that was created for and by us. So in the home, this presentation itself was really inspired by some clients that I work with. So I'm a trauma specialist. And so the majority of folks that come to me have experienced some level of trauma, some more severe than others. And there's a phrase that I despise. There are a few phrases that I despise that I reached out about when I first was thinking about putting this presentation together. And one of them is, what happens in this house stays in this house. It is a phrase that most Black folks know. And I don't know when it started. I've heard it my entire life. But from this side, when people hear phrases such as what happens in this house stays in this house, that means the good and the bad, right? And so I really encourage you to think about the language that's happening and what is being received when people hear that. And then if harm is happening, can there be any resolution or any intervention if nobody knows what's happening, right? So that is one of the things that inspired this presentation. So something for folks to think about: when somebody in your life says that something happened to them, believe them the first time. I have quite a few clients who come and they say, "You're the first person that believed my story," or "I told the story to my mom and she didn't believe me," or "I got kicked out because they believed somebody else over me." So when we begin to talk about how to make a shift and a change, not only in the Black household and across the households, but definitely in the Black household, one of the first things is believing the person when they tell you the story the first time. Another thing for us to consider is really exploring, what does connectedness look like in the home? And this was alluded to when looking at the African-centered perspective. But I, as a person who lives with anxiety and who treats folks who are impacted by anxiety, I know that a chaotic room, a chaotic car, only increases the chaos inside of me. And so really exploring, like, how is the environment shaping how a person is functioning? Can we function in a chaotic environment? How are the dynamics, right? So what are the dynamics? How are folks talking to each other in the house? Are folks talking to each other in the house? One of my very basic, but I think very powerful homework assignments for couples, for families, is to share a meal together without electronics. So what does it look like to share a meal? What does it look like to talk to each other? What does it look like to be present with one another? And how can that then begin to shift and change those dynamics? Especially because we live in a technology era right now. Everything is about technology. People are texting and tweeting and chirping and da da da, and oftentimes not sitting down and speaking and talking to each other. If someone mentions, or if someone has not mentioned that religion is a source of support, don't offer to pray it away when they have a concern. That can be off-putting for folks, especially if what they experienced has that religious component. If they have experienced religious harm, right? That should not be the immediate response. Now, if it is a source of support, that's different. So if a person has already identified, hey, my religion is very supportive to me, this is how, this is a part of my functioning, then absolutely, definitely say, hey, let's pray. Would you like to pray? Right. But I think how that can come across to folks who have not identified that as a source of support is dismissive, right? So they're coming to you about a mental health concern, and your immediate response is, well, we're just going to pray about it, and we're not going to address it in any other way. And so just really being cognizant and mindful of, is the person that you're talking to, do they feel like that is support? Is that the support that they need? Um, Something that I didn't include on here, but I just thought about, is you want to ask, if a person comes to you with, a person in your family, in your circle, comes to you needing some support. You want to ask, how can I support you? Right. And so I think our go to is to try to support people from the place that we receive support. And that's not always helpful. And so sometimes we may offer support to a loved one experiencing mental health concerns. It can be very practical. So let's make a plan. Let's do something. Let's call this person. Let's use this resource. It can be emotional. So I can understand how difficult a time this is, or I've experienced something similar. And that is, I can empathize with you, right? It could be physical. So they could ask for a hug, you know, they can want you to sit and hold their hand. You can sit and rub their back, right? But the biggest takeaway in this is asking, what's the best way that I can support you? And then for you, for the support person, making sure that you are supporting in a way that you're not overextending. So if you can't, make it to breakfast at 7 a.m., don't agree to that, right? Or, somebody is asking for something that you can't give. Hey, I can't do that for you, but how about I do this? So really opening up that dialogue and that communication around what support truly looks like, and asking, what can I do for you? Um, the next tool, having open dialogue about how you would censor your own mental health. I definitely grew up in the era of do what I say, not as I do. And I had a whole lot of questions. I was a child that asked a lot of questions. And so that didn't really make sense to me. I really wanted it to be modeled. I wanted to see you doing the things. And I've had a similar conversation with a client who is trying to get her son to do XYZ. And I said to her, well, why don't you do it with him? You know? And so I think, you know, there is space for respect and authority and all the things. And then there's also space for, I too am taking care of my mental health, and this is how, right? So really having open conversations, and some of the things that we are impacted by are genetic. And so those conversations need to be happening anyway. So for example, alcoholism is genetic. So that can be an open conversation. Mood disorders such as bipolar disorder, that's genetic. Thought disorders such as schizophrenia, brief psychotic disorders, those are genetic. Depression is genetic. Anxiety is genetic. So when we circle this back around to, I want to decrease the stigma, it starts with us, right? Having those conversations. I remember my aunt, da 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 da, or your dad, da 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 da, or your cousin. So really sitting down and talking about, these are the things that have happened, and not speaking to them from a negative perspective, but just from, this is something that our family has experienced. And this is how I'm going to deal with it, or this is what I've done, or this is what we will do. Right. I think it's really comforting, because being impacted by a mental health disorder or illness can feel very isolating. You will find that folks feel like it's just them, or why is something only wrong with me? And so I think there can be some validation in hearing, oh no, other people have experienced this, or I have experienced this, and this is how I'm attending to it, right? And that is going to land very differently when you are encouraging them to engage in their own treatment because they've seen you do the same, you know? Um, I'm very intentional about like working out and my children seeing that, or my children seeing me pray, or, they know that when we go to church, I'm going to go to the altar, or they see those things, right? So just really being mindful that children are paying attention to what we're doing and what we're not doing, right? So, and how can that begin to encourage them to take care of themselves in different ways? Um, and the last one is kind of the same. So what does it look like to encourage other folks in your life to seek support by you modeling that behavior? You're not going to always have to say this is what you need to do, because they're going to see that you're doing it. They're going to see you working out. They're going to see you eating good. They're going to hear you apologize, right? We want we sometimes we expect regulation from children and we don't regulate ourselves, right? So what are some things as a parent, for the caregivers and the parents tuning in, what are some things that I'm trying to get my kids to do that they don't see me do? And is that the barrier, right? Is that the reason why they're not engaging in whatever that thing is? So it's definitely some food for thought. There are lots of dialogue around reclamation and resilience and Black joy. And something that I wanted to read a quote by Brandy Factory, who has created a platform around Black joy. And she says that Black joy affirms that I'm not a victim. I am an agent of change. It rejects the idea that violence, injustice, discrimination, prejudice, and dominance over others is not normal or acceptable actions. And so I think we are now really transitioning into a time of, while there are a lot of things happening in the world between a criminal running for office and unjust murders of children, there are a lot of things happening. But we still get the right to access joy. And being able to tap into that joy is a form of resistance. Being able to tap into that joy is about reclamation. um, it is about being resilient. I talk to my clients about resilience. So resilience is usually defined as what happens after you've overcome adversity, right? So I always do this exercise around, let's talk about the relationships that didn't work, for example. What did you learn from those relationships? Right? That's resilience. What skill did you walk away from? So the relationship didn't work, which sucks and it hurt and all the things. But how were you changed after that? You know, um, another piece for Black folks um, in this process of navigating our own mental health is being able to tell our story. For a long time, our stories were told by someone else. And so you will see a lot of the literature speaking to counter narratives, right? So even in the healing circles and even in engaging in therapy, making sure that there's space that the client can tell their side of the story and they can be heard. For the clinicians that are observing and tuned in and locked in, that may look like you allowing them to write a comic strip. They may write a poem. They may do a play. There's a young lady right now in Charlotte who she's been doing a play speaking to her anxiety, right? So all of those things are tools of healing that can be used because there's power in owning our story, and not allowing other people to tell that story for us. So I mentioned already joy is a form of resistance, and I think Brandy Factory is her name. She has one of the platforms around Black joy. And then lastly, sometimes you have to quit. I think there is definitely this culture of never stop and keep going, and no sleep. And first of all, we need sleep. But secondly, sometimes you have to know when it is time to quit a situation because it's not good for your mental health, you know? So we do need money, right? We need money. So I'm not saying everybody walk out of your job. This is not the Beyonce song, but there is um, there is power, there is importance in knowing, like, I have nothing else to gain from this, or it is taking more out of me than I'm receiving. So it may be time for me to quit. Um, and again, I think that is a form of resistance that's just not talked about enough. You know, um, some of the earlier narratives around resistance was to keep going no matter what. And I don't know that that's best for all of us. I don't know that fares well for some of us who may be a little more sensitive to issues than others. You know, it may not be helpful to keep powering through and powering through and powering through, knowing when it's time for me to slow down, or it's time for me to adjust, or it's time for me to pivot. I think is very, very important. So there may be some challenges navigating working with clients who are of a different culture. I mentioned before, a lot of my research and my platform is around being able to practice from this anti-racist space. And this next piece is specifically for folks who are working with clients. And one of the first things is to think about, you know, your own intersectionality. So Kimberly Crenshaw, Black woman, lawyer, first introduced this concept in the law space. And we've adapted and transitioned it to social work. And the way that I teach it to my students, and that I want folks to think about it, is you are coming with your own sets of identities, and the client is coming with their own set of identities. And how will the two meet? Right. So you may have the best intentions, but one of your identities still may trigger someone, and not taking that personally, and really understanding that you may have the best intentions, but the client may not be in a space to open up to you, and not taking that personally, because it's a privilege for a person to sit across from us and agree to be vulnerable. They don't have to do that just because we have the alphabet behind our name. So making sure that we don't take that for granted, that folks are willing to sit down and engage with us. So some cultural differences that may be challenging, some things that we need to take into consideration. One definitely is language. So being very mindful of your words. And if you are unsure about something in their culture, asking them works, right? Being mindful about religion, like I mentioned before, is religion a source of support for the client? Which, if it is, absolutely include that in your work. Or is it was it connected to some harm that they experienced in the past? And being mindful of that. Eye contact, you know, is that something that is that a concept? Is that a form of communication in their culture, or is it not? So that you don't take it personally if they're not making eye contact, and you know that it has nothing to do with you. Core values, perspectives on discipline. So every culture does not treat discipline the same, you know. So again, making sure that you don't make any assumptions about discipline because of your own culture. Clothing, how folks present, being mindful that looks differently across cultures as well. Gestures, celebrations. I always say that, you know, the main rule of thumb is asking before we assume, right? And even if a client is being brought to you for something that happened in school or at home or whatever, making sure that you get their perspective, because their perspective is going to be different from the teachers. Their perspective is going to be different from the partner, from the coworkers. So making sure that you explore their perspective and you get that information from them before just jumping into, okay, this is maladaptive. This is something bad that's happened, and oh, this needs to be punished. So although it can be difficult for us to navigate and understand different cultures, I think there is space for growth and space for learning, as long as we stay open, as long as we don't assume that our norm is everybody else's norm. I don't think that's ever good. And again, we are asking questions over making assumptions. So some steps to consider in this work. What are some of your own biases? And I know some people say, I don't have any biases. I like everyone. That's not true. We have all had experiences, and those experiences really shape and impact how we function. And so we definitely have biases. And as clinicians, I challenge you to think about what are some of yours, so that you'll be aware if they come up as you engage with clients. If there is an issue that comes up, and one thing I forgot to add to this, reflecting on the issue and taking it to supervision. So we should all be in supervision. I feel like harm happens when we as therapists, as clinicians, practice in isolation. So if there is a concern and there's a microaggression that comes up, there's something that comes up in regards to culture, I think taking that to supervision is a good space to kind of break it down and look at it from different angles. You can always ask, hey, can you tell me more about this? Hey, I was under the impression of, can you clear that up for me? You can engage in problem solving. So this is how we would address the problem in the future. This is a future issue that may come up. But all in all, keeping in mind that, this work should be client-centered. It should definitely be client-centered. So just as a recap, as we begin to wrap up, and I'm going to throw the QR code up for folks to take a survey. There is a long history attached to stigma. There's a long history of how society has treated Black folks as it pertains to mental health. So knowing what that history looks like is super important. And then recognizing like what we can do in some of our own homes, how we can treat people, how we can have a bit more awareness and a bit more empathy, especially if we don't understand. Just kind of being mindful of our language, being mindful of the environment that we are creating, and knowing that what we say to people really impacts how they move, and a person may come to you and your family and, they may say, I'm feeling depressed, and, making sure your answer is, you don't got nothing to be depressed about, because that is what was told to us decades ago, right? We didn't have nothing, so what are we so sad about? So really trying to kind of shift our mindset and keep in mind that trauma and different experiences, they are individualized, right? So as folks in our family are coming to us for support, recognizing that even if you don't agree with the situation, you can still empathize with them, right? So you can still offer some empathy, a perspective to think about, integrating for the clinicians that are tuned in, is that African-centered perspective, which leans heavily into community healing, and not feeling like everything has to be done by ourselves and to ourselves. So if you are treating folks in the Black community, thinking about how you can integrate some of those. And if you're watching and you have your own family, how can you integrate some of those principles into how you function as a family, right? How could there be more connectedness? How could there be more of a sense of belonging? How are we exploring spirituality? What does that look like? All in the fight against mental health, recognizing that all of us have the propensity to be impacted by mental health, right? So even if you've never had anything genetic in your family, because we walk and live and breathe in a world where all of these things are happening, we could experience trauma, we could experience anxiety, we could experience depression. And so making sure that we are not othering people and, there's something wrong with them and not me, you know. Um, One of the things that I didn't include that I thought about just now is that, mental health doesn't have a look, right? And I think we've seen that with the recent um, news of different celebrities and folks who were impacted ended up um, dying by suicide, right? So I think making sure that we are not trying to put people in a box or judge people, and recognizing that it could be any of us. It can be any of us. So I think I'll just end with, um, take care of yourself and one another, right? And really think about, what does that mean to take care of yourself holistically and attend to the different parts and pieces of yourself, and how can you take care of folks in your community as well. If you could scan that QR code, I think I have a link as well, but if you could scan that QR code and provide us with some feedback, that would be great. I really appreciate folks taking their lunch hour to sit in. There's the link on the screen. So please click that link on the screen or scan the QR code, provide some feedback. I would love to hear from you wherever you are. Here's my contact information. You can add me on LinkedIn. I will often engage in presentations. I'll facilitate trainings for organizations, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit. I'll engage in speaking engagements for students. So please, please, please keep in touch. And that's all I got. Y'all take care.